2024 was a year full of firsts for the Nintendo Switch Online and the more expensive expansion pack. It was a year when some of Rare's most iconic games hit the service. Starfy came straight out of Japan, and M-rated games were all the rage. A year full of high-profile heroes like Mega Man, Mario, Donkey Kong, and Link. And just to be thorough, Nintendo even threw out a classic Pokemon game, even if it wasn't the one that people actually wanted. But with all these big games hitting the service, does that mean that 2024 was the best year ever for the Nintendo Switch Online? Well, to answer that question, I decided to crunch the numbers, pull the reviews, and look at the year's biggest winners and losers. This is the Nintendo Switch Online report card for 2024. One year ago, when I predicted what would happen in 2024, I was skeptical that Nintendo would deliver on the games. I argued at the time that based on the numbers, every time the Nintendo Switch Online service reached a new high, it was often followed the next year with a dip. Plus, with no new consoles being added to the service, I figured that it was going to be a down year. Thankfully, I was wrong. Kind of. You see, in 2024, Nintendo managed to publish a total of 56 games, which is better than 2023 by a single game. That's right, we went from 55 games to 56 games. Sure, you could look at it as basically a tie, but it's also the most games Nintendo has ever released on the service in a single year. That's a big deal, especially this many years into the service. That's also well above the previous average, which was around 40 games released per year. Now, as you can see from this chart, Nintendo hasn't especially been consistent across the years. They started out with 28 games in 2018, the year that the Nintendo Switch Online debuted. This was then followed by a big spike up to 45 games in 2019, due in large part to the addition of the Super NES. Then a big drop in 2020 when it was only 21 games added, followed with 41 games in 2021, and then 29 games in 2022. This now marks the second year in a row where we've had more than 50 games. I mean, we're essentially getting a game a week, even if Nintendo doesn't spread it out quite like that. As expected, no retro consoles were added to the Nintendo Switch Online in 2024. At this point, I think that pretty much everybody agrees that if Nintendo's going to add more consoles, it's most likely going to come with the release of new hardware later this year. With no new systems to support, last year's breakdown looks a lot like what we saw in 2023. Once again, the Game Boy brand dominated, with 11 games on the Game Boy Advance, and 15 games spread across the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. This included a lot of franchise releases, such as 5 Mega Man games, 3 Starfy games, and 3 Donkey Kong Land games that were released right at the end of the year. In fact, Donkey Kong and Mega Man made up more than half of the Game Boy lineup, with another 6 of the games featuring Mario. Now, coming in third place is the Nintendo Entertainment System, which had a surprisingly strong year thanks to the dizzying amount of rare titles that hit the service, including fan favorites like RC Pro-Am, Snake Rattle and Roll, and Cobra Triangle. Unfortunately, early generation duds like Urban Champion and Donkey Kong Jr. Math also snuck through. Next up is the Super NES, which actually tripled its 2023 output, giving subscribers an impressive 9 games. This was a surprisingly varied group, with racing games, beat-em-ups, puzzlers, one-on-one fighters, shoot-em-ups, and even dodgeball. Of course, the big news in 2024 was the M-rated section of the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack. As you can imagine, this impacted the Nintendo 64 specifically, with 8 games being added last year, the same amount that was added in 2023. We saw some big hitters like Perfect Dark and Banjo-Tooie, along with some cult classics like Blast Corps and Shadow Man. Still, it is worth noting that 8 games is down from the highs of 2022, when Nintendo released a total of 11 Nintendo 64 games. And finally, to wrap up the systems, there's the Genesis. The good news, of course, is that it finally showed signs of life after a year and a half with no releases. That's no exaggeration either, as there was a 519-day gap between Genesis releases. With a drought that long, it won't surprise anybody that we only got 3 Genesis titles in 2024, down from the 8 that we got 1 year earlier. Yeah, that's awful, but we're going to talk more about that in a minute. For what it's worth, this was an exceptionally good year for subscribers of the standard Nintendo Switch Online, as a total of 34 of the 56 games released last year were either for the Nintendo Entertainment System, Super NES, Game Boy, or Game Boy Color. That's an increase of 7 games year to year, and 61% of the total games released in 2024. In contrast, the expansion pack only offered 22 games, down 6 from the previous 12 months. Now look, I'm not here to say that the expansion pack was a bad deal in 2024, but it's clear that the vanilla service was a far better value, at least when it came to total games. But hey, maybe there's a different metric to measure these games. Well, it's nice to have more games. That doesn't mean anything if they all suck. Thankfully, the games that were released in 2024 did not suck. But how'd they compare to 2023? If we're just looking at the overall score, then 2024 came out with an average of 79%. That's down slightly from the 82% average that we saw in 2023. However, it's up from the 77% that we saw in 2022. In fact, if you average every score since the launch in 2018, the actual overall average is 79%. Exactly the same score that we got out of 2024. I mean, just look at this chart. The averages are shockingly consistent over the years. Now, if we're going by the system, then it's the Genesis that had the best year with an average of 85%. But again, you have to keep in mind that this is an average of only 3 games. In second place is the Nintendo 64 with 82%, followed by the Game Boy Advance in third with 81%. Speaking of handhelds, the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color combo came in with a 79%, with the Nintendo Entertainment System close behind with a 78%. Rounding out the list is the Super NES with an average of 73%, though you have to understand that many of the higher profile games were not reviewed due to them originally only coming out in Japan. Speaking of which, there were a total of 10 games that were released in the US and Europe for the first time in 2024. Now, in case you're wondering, the highest scoring games included Metroid Zero Mission with an average of 91%, Perfect Dark on the Nintendo 64 with a 93%, and The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords on top with an impressive 97%. The bottom 3 are Cosmo Gang the Puzzler with a middling 58%, early generation NES game Mock Rider with a 52%, and the shockingly underrated Alleyway being rated the worst Nintendo Switch Online game of the year with an average score of, oh, this hurts, 37%. Man, I strongly disagree with that score. Alleyway shouldn't be anywhere near the bottom. Going into 2024, the big question on everybody's mind was how Nintendo would transition from one generation to the next. Specifically, would this be the Nintendo Switch Online's last gasp? Well, with 56 games released last year, I think we can all breathe a sigh of relief. In fact, by all accounts, this was a really good year for the longevity of the Nintendo Switch Online as a retro game playing service. With more games coming out than ever before, and Nintendo announcing that the NSO games on the Switch will be backwards compatible on the new hardware, I'd argue that the subscription service is actually in a really good place going into 2025. Look, I guarantee when the Switch 2 comes out, you're gonna hear Nintendo make a case that there are over 300 classic games ready to be played on day one. Couple that with the prospect of them adding even more consoles, and you definitely have them making for a strong year. My guess is that we break the 56 game record, but hey, it's probably a little too early to make that prediction. If you believed the rumors going into last year, then the Switch 2 was going to be the big console to get in 2024. Obviously, that didn't happen. Early in the year, Nintendo announced that their next system wouldn't ship to retailers until some point in 2025, and then they just left us in the dark for the rest of the year. And every time you thought that they were going to announce the Switch 2, they ended up pulling a fast one on all of us and just announced an alarm clock instead. The truth is, the Switch 2 is probably better off coming out in 2025. The Switch ended up having a pretty good year in 2024, and it seemed like there was more than enough software announced to keep gamers happy all the way up to the launch of the new system. As much as I would have loved to have gotten my hands on a new Switch, there's really no reason for Nintendo to rush. And who knows, maybe that extra time will allow Nintendo to actually make enough consoles to keep up with demand. We can only hope. We knew that the big story would probably be the Game Boy lineup of consoles, since they were just added in 2023. However, it was two legacy consoles, the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super NES, that quietly had the biggest improvements of the year. These were two systems that were on a downward trajectory, largely overshadowed by the likes of the Nintendo 64 and the Game Boy. But both systems really stepped things up in 2024, with the NES jumping from 6 games to 10, and the Super NES going from 3 games all the way up to 9, tripling 2023. And while we can complain that some of those games were first-generation NES titles that literally nobody wants, I'd say that both systems ended up with a number of iconic releases, some of which came to the US for the very first time. Look, I hate to say it, but for the second year in a row, the Sega Genesis was a big loser. In fact, this year they're an even bigger loser than before. Last year I noted that the Genesis was on a downward trajectory. I mean, it started with 19 games in 2021 and then 17 games in 2022, but then everything went sideways when 2023 brought us only 8 Genesis games. And then there's 2024, where the whole thing fell right off the cliff. After a 519-day drought, we finally got not 1, not 2, but 3 Genesis games. That's right, 3. That's just 5% of the Nintendo Switch Online in 2024. This is clearly the most ignored console on the service, and it's not even close. The second worst supported system on the NSO has nearly 3 times the releases as the Genesis. And that is why, once again, it's one of the biggest losers of the year. But could it be that things are actually looking up for the Genesis in 2025? Look, there are many people out there who believe that now that the Sega Genesis Classic Collection has been delisted, we're going to start to see more of those games at the Nintendo Switch Online. After all, many of the games being delisted are high-profile titles that we've all been waiting for, such as Missing Streets of Rage and Phantasy Star sequels. Personally, I'm still not that convinced that there's any connection between the delisting and the games hitting the expansion pack. But my mind could be changed if we start to see an uptick in Genesis games hitting the service. Perhaps this time next year, I'll be calling the Genesis a winner. We'll see. Despite being known for their family-friendly games, Nintendo's consoles have occasionally dipped their toes into the wide world of M-rated games. Sure, it took Nintendo 7 years to add a mature section to the Nintendo Switch Online, but now that it's here, they've done a pretty good job of adding to it. Of the 8 Nintendo 64 games added last year, 4 of them were rated M. That's 50%. Not bad for a Nintendo system. Best of all, this leaves the door open for a lot more M-rated games like Killer Instinct Gold, Turok 3, and maybe even Conker's Bad Fur Day. I know there are a lot of people hoping for Resident Evil 2 to show up at some point, but with the remake already out there, I honestly don't think that's going to be showing up anytime soon. But as we've demonstrated in the past, my predictions are spotty sometimes. Late in the year, Nintendo confused, well, pretty much everybody by drip-feeding the 3 Donkey Kong Land games over 3 consecutive weeks. This was a decidedly weird move, as they usually just dump all of the games at once. I mean, we really only have to go back to June to see Nintendo add 5 different Mega Man games to the service in a single day. So the idea of them releasing 3 of them just days apart from one another is definitely peculiar, to say the least. Especially when you remember that Donkey Kong Land 2 came out just 24 hours before Nintendo dumped a bunch of Genesis games onto the service for the first time in over 500 days. It just doesn't seem like there was a lot of thought or planning involved. Well, that's definitely odd. What drags this series into the loser category is how Nintendo handled the 3rd game. You see, as American gamers were getting a port of Donkey Kong Land 3 on the Game Boy Pocket, the same game that was released in the US in 1997, Japanese subscribers were getting the updated version for the Game Boy Color that was released in 2000 that never came to America. Let me tell you, this would have been the perfect time to give us the slightly different and much more colorful version of the game. Or maybe you could just drop both of them and let the fans experience both versions. What the hell's the point of keeping one of them locked away in Japan, especially in a year when Starfy finally came west? It's not like it's one of those Fire Emblem games where it's full of dialogue and text that has to be translated. Gamers are still going to have a great time, even if they're not privy to the nuanced story of Donkey Kong Land 3. This is just dumb. More than anything else, 2024 was a year-long celebration for all things Rare. For most of the year, Nintendo found a lot of fun ways to sneak must-own Rare games into the mix, including the Donkey Kong Land trilogy that we just talked about. From the moment they dug up classics like RC Pro-Am and Blast Corps, we knew that this was going to be a great year for fans of the Stamper Brothers. And let me tell you, Nintendo delivered with both big and small games spread across a bunch of different consoles. And here's the really exciting news. With Rare celebrating their 40th anniversary in 2025, I have a hunch that we're actually going to see a lot more games from this iconic developer. Think about it. There's still a lot of high-profile Rare games that have yet to find their way to the Nintendo Switch Online. I'm talking about the Battletoads on not only the Nintendo Entertainment System, but also the Game Boy. And then there's RC Pro-Am 2, Diddy Kong Racing, and of course Donkey Kong 64. Couple those with already mentioned games like Killer Instinct Gold and Conker's Bad Fur Day, and you have yourself a pretty strong lineup of Rare games for 2025. All in all, 2024 was a good year for the Nintendo Switch Online. While you might prefer the higher profile games that came out in 2022 or 2023, Nintendo didn't slouch when it came to the last 12 months. They filled in a lot of franchise holes, especially on the handheld with games like Mega Man and Donkey Kong Land. They also brought a bunch of cult classics to the West, including 3 different Starfy games. At the same time, they balanced that out with releases in the Metroid, Mario, and Zelda series, as well as fun one-offs like Iggy's Rockin' Balls, Shadow Man, and Blast Corps. And with 56 games released in 2024, this was yet another record-breaking year. So yes, I would say that the Nintendo Switch Online had a very strong year indeed. Now, looking forward to 2025, so far, Nintendo hasn't announced anything. I expect that we'll probably get something in January, perhaps something like Donkey Kong 64 or Diddy Kong Racing, to coincide with the upcoming release of that Donkey Kong Country Returns game on the Switch. Personally speaking, I'd love to see them go with Donkey Kong 94, but I mean, that has to be in the pipeline somewhere, right? Just from that, you can see that Nintendo really still has a lot of big games that they can release at pretty much any point in the next 12 months. And things could get even more interesting if we see new systems added to the service with the Switch 2 coming out. I mean, would it really surprise anybody if we saw a treasure trove of Nintendo DS games join the service later this year? As it stands right now, Nintendo only needs 16 more games before they hit the big 300. If this year is anything like 2024, then we'll probably get there around April. Simply from a marketing perspective, having more than 300 classic games sounds a whole lot better than coming up shy and then having to round up. So it honestly wouldn't surprise me if we saw Nintendo continue to support the subscription service right up to the launch of the Switch 2. And with the chance that we might even see a new console added when the new hardware arrives, I predict that we're probably going to hit another milestone in 2025. Who knows, maybe I'll eat my words later. But I predict that this will be the year when the Nintendo Switch Online finally hits 60 games. Prove me wrong, Nintendo! Hey, thanks for watching me break down the Nintendo Switch Online's winners and losers. I'm honestly really excited to get back into doing a proper review crew episode, so I'm hoping they announce something this week. Don't leave me hanging, Nintendo! Now, here's the question I have for you. What are your thoughts on the Nintendo Switch Online in 2024? Yay or nay? You heard me make the argument that I think this is a pretty strong year, so I'm excited to hear what your thoughts are in the comments below. In other news, I'm going on vacation next week, so I've spent the last few days working on basically 2 weeks worth of content, including this Mario Kart 64 versus Diddy Kong Racing magazine matchup that, oh man, it's gonna leave you speechless. It's so good. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,